I don't know why so many people wrote in and asked me to respond to this latest exchange between Christopher Monckton and Stefan Molyneux. Molyneux seems quite capable of challenging Monckton's claims himself, because Molyneux believes in looking at both sides of the issue. I mean, there's nothing more boring than somebody who's only ever looked at evidence which supports his or her own conclusions. Look at the contrary evidence, and that will breed, I think, a very important and virtuous humility. Molyneux listens to Monckton, who represents the side that thinks it's all a conspiracy. They are about to impose a communist world government on the world. I am sure he also listens to research scientists, who explain the evidence that carbon dioxide has been the primary driver of global temperature for the last 500 million years, and the evidence that a doubling of carbon dioxide from pre-industrial levels will lead to a temperature rise of between 2 and 4.5 degrees centigrade. So let's start with the side that thinks the whole thing is a conspiracy of greedy scientists who are perpetrating this hoax to impose a communist world government or to get rich, or whatever else that motivates them to write supposedly fraudulent papers. Right, it's very simple. The first serious predictions made based on what are called an ensemble of several models taken together were done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The rate of global warming is not much more than half of what they originally predicted. Well, to use the scientific form of rebuttal, that's complete bollocks. The 1990 prediction was the first by the IPCC and quite crude. It only looked at warming caused by greenhouse gases. So short-term and unpredictable variables, like fluctuating solar output and aerosol pollution, weren't considered. So if we look at what the IPCC was actually predicting, the temperature trend due to greenhouse gases, which is the light blue line in this graph, is bang on target. I bet someone is already typing out a post to say, what good are predictions if they can't take short-term variables into account? Well, the answer is that short-term variables are, by definition, short-term, and they re-variable. They go up and down over a period of a few years. Dover, by a period of a few years, there, and they go over a few so they may reduce warming in one part of the projection and increase warming in another part. But overall, they make no difference to the long-term trend due to CO2. Even if you want to pretend the IPCC graph was taking these variables into account, the actual temperature trend is still within the IPCC estimates. Researchers say that because the warming effect of carbon dioxide is so strong that it's overcome all these short-term cooling factors over the last few years and continued to send temperatures to new record highs. The only way Monckton can claim it hasn't to cherry-pick his temperature data set. He wouldn't do that, would he? In fact, between approximately 1997 and 2015, there was a period of 18 years and 9 months, according to one of the data sets, with no global warming at all. As according to one of the data sets is the key point. And which one is that? I'm sure Molyneux is going to ask him, but let's take a look at the data set Monckton's cherry-picked in the past. There is the actual record from the scientists. There is the trend line calculated on it. It is horizontal. No warming has happened for 17 years, 9 months. It's the temperature data set from remote sensing systems, ERS. This data set has been the odd one out for over a decade now because all the other data sets show clear atmospheric warming over that 18-year period. Every scientific institute that monitors global temperature agrees that there's been roughly the same amount of atmospheric warming over that period. all acceptors. And that's the dataset Monckton chose to cite. Now, clearly there's something wrong when everyone's measuring average global temperature and only one measurement is way out of line. And Roy Spencer agreed there had to be something wrong with Earth's data. And there was. Earth discovered that its data were erroneous because of a miscalculation of diurnal cycle drift and admitted this error in a paper published in March 2016. There is a word so to do so mark so there 20 do there and this higher But for some reason, Monckton didn't mention this. So why doesn't Molyneux ask Monckton which data set he's quoting? And if it's source, why didn't he mention the correction? Monckton asked Monckton why he ignored all the other data sets which all show warming. Don't worry, as soon as Monckton pauses for breath, I'm sure Molyneux will jump in and question his claims. But not yet, because Monckton's already moved on to where he published all this evidence. I published a paper in the Journal of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the Science Bulletin, in January of last year, in which I pointed out that there were various dubieties, various uncertainties, various errors in the models that had not. Well, let's not get carried away. The journal Monckton's talking about, the Science Bulletin, previously called the Chinese Science Bulletin, does have a reasonably respected print version. It's one of many journals that describe themselves as supervised, sponsored, or co-sponsored by the Chinese Academy of Sciences. But Monckton's paper wasn't published in the print version, it was in the separate online open access version, and if you want to get a paper published there, you have to stump up $2,500. Pay-to-play online journals like this are not highly respected and are often poorly peer-reviewed. It's a bit like a Vaughan paying to have his poetry published in a vanity book of poems and then claiming it's been published by the Royal Society of Literature. One climatologist at the University of Reading found what he called glaring fundamental errors in Monckton's paper. It shouldn't surprise fans of my Monckton Buncombe video series, which showed that Monckton has a history of getting his sums wrong. Here's my own calculation. And we get 1.6 degrees Celsius as the change in temperature for a doubling of CO2. The warming we would expect to get if we doubled the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, that is what's known as climate sensitivity, will be about 1/5 of a Celsius degree. Just a little bit more than 1/5 of a Celsius degree. In his piece in the Forum on Physics and Society newsletter, Monckton gives yet another figure for temperature rise, 0.58 degrees centigrade. Apart from the howling error of calling Kelvin degrees Kelvin, which would have earned a rebuke from any high school physics teacher, Monckton made a bigger mix-up in that last calculation when he claimed to have divided sensitivity by 3, but in fact he erroneously divided forcing by 3. Facing up forcing and sensitivity is the climatological equivalent of confusing time and distance. And now Monckton's come up with yet another calculation for the Earth's equilibrium temperature. I can now prove that the variance either side of the central estimate of global warming as a result of feedback is now only going to be kind of less than half a Celsius degree. Well, let's not hold our breath. Despite having come up with a variety of different calculations over the years, whose results vary by a factor of 8, not one of Monckton's projections has even come close to matching actual temperature trends. He even predicted that global temperatures would follow solar activity downwards when in fact they followed carbon dioxide levels upwards. So just 10 minutes in, and surely there's more than enough for Molyneux to challenge or at least ask for some clarification. And he will question Monckton's claims because fortunately for us, Molyneux is a skeptic. It is strange to me that a skepticism about highly conjectural source data should be considered anti-scientific when it seems to me that the scientific method is entirely predicated on the rigorous application of skepticism, particularly to projected or modeled data. Exactly right. And here we have projected and modeled data based on a cherry-picked and erroneous data set from a man with no scientific training and a history of making calculation blunders. So go for it, Stephan. Apply that skepticism. Well, this is, I think, a lot of things that are not understood by people who are pro-global warming or who have trouble with the skeptics. Oh dear, I'm a little disappointed in you, Stephan. Whatever happened to the rigorous application of skepticism, particularly to projected or modeled data? Well, maybe Molyneux just giving Monckton free rein, because he also has real climatologists on his show who present the evidence supporting the science. Let's see. He will be speaking at the Global Warming and Inconveniently Conference in Phoenix, Arizona, and he is the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. He's an expert on energy and industrial policy. I mean, there's nothing more boring than somebody who's only ever looked at evidence which supports his or her own conclusions. What is the problem? What is the concern? You pimp your website for a second to make sure that people can go and get to the source data. It's climate skeptic come. Is that right? There is no guarantee that it's going to get warmer just because there's more Katu. You know, it turns out that every one of his guests simply chose the belief that it's all a conspiracy. So what does Molyneux believe when it comes to actual science? There's no question that Katu is produced by human beings. There's no question that it has increased over the past, say 50 or 70 years. And there's no doubt that has a warming factor in the atmosphere. As far as that goes, I mean, anybody who would deny that is having trouble tying their shoelaces and getting out of the door in the morning. He just doesn't accept the conclusion of researchers in fields as far apart as volcanology, glaciology, paleoclimatology, atmospheric physics, who've all done studies independent of each other, some using models, some looking at temperature responses to past changes in Katu, whose results all cluster around the 3 degrees centigrade range for a doubling of Katu. He's absolutely sure it'll be a lot less. Why? There's no doubt that putting additional Katu into a particular closed system is going to increase the temperature. What people don't generally understand is this idea of the multiplier, that they can't get to the catastrophic numbers that perhaps they want to get in order to get the scare money from the government. So they have this magic multiplier. I think I understand the problem. Whenever someone takes a scientific fact and calls it magic, what he usually means is he doesn't understand how it works. And the part of the theory Molyneux doesn't to get is what's called positive feedback. I've explained this before in me videos. A doubling of Catu on its own would cause warming of just over 1 degree centigrade. And Molyneux seems to accept this, and so does his most recent guest. So 1 degree is not enough to worry anyone. You know it's probably good for the earth. You know I would like to have a little longer growing season. All my backyard garden has been killed by frost, and I would have gotten a better crop this year. We'd have had a few more growing days. Well, never mind all that. So we accept the calculation of climatologists that there'll be about 1 degree of warming due to a doubling of Catu. And when you increase the temperature of the earth by 1 degree centigrade, climatologists say a few things start to happen that increase the temperature even more, what Stefan calls the magic multiplier. So let's see if it really is magic or basic physics that pretty much anyone can grasp. All you have to do is look at each of these multipliers and say whether you think it's physics or magic. Let's start with this one. As global temperatures increase, more water evaporates. Physics or magic? That one's physics. And warmer air can hold more of this water vapor. That's also physics. And water vapor is a powerful greenhouse gas. Physics. So from a 1 degree rise in temperature due to a doubling of Catu, the water vapor content of the atmosphere will increase, causing further warming. Those who said magic, I'm sorry. It's all very basic physics. Next, positive feedback factor. Albedo. White surfaces reflect solar radiation while dark surfaces absorb it. SOIS, which is white, reflects most of the solar energy that falls on it, while the darker ocean absorbs it. Did you say magic? No, sorry, that's physics. So as ice melts and reveals the darker ocean underneath, the Earth reflects less solar radiation back into space and absorbs more, causing more warming. No, not magic again. That's physics. Next, the more concerned we get about global warming, the more likely it is that the gods on Olympus will step in and make everything right again. Physics or magic? That one is magic. I could add feedback factors like melting permafrost that causes the release of large quantities of methane, and even more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. But I won't labor the point. These are all basic principles of physics. They re not magic and they re not mysteries, unless of course you don't to know about them. As for the idea that these physical principles were somehow invented in order to get scare money from the government, perhaps he exaggerated what Molyneux said slightly. They can't get to the catastrophic numbers that perhaps they want to get in order to get the scare money from the government. No, he really did say that. Once again, it's a conspiracy theory that doesn't match reality. The conclusion that an increase in forcing would lead to positive feedback has been around for decades. The National Academy of Sciences described the factors involved in positive feedback as far back as 1979. Charles Keeling of the Scripps Institute wrote about them in 1969. So it was the discovery of positive feedback that led to the calculation of increased temperature, not the other way round. If Molyneux ever gets to see this video, I'd like him to clarify if he still thinks positive feedback is magic, or if he accepts that it's physics. And does he think the conspiracy to Hoax really did begin in the 1960s? Molyneux' rejection of positive feedback, the magic multiplier as he calls it, is not just because he doesn't understand how it works. It's also based on his misunderstanding of the Earth's geological history. It's kind of a common sense thing, and given that Catu was far higher in the past than it is now, if runaway Katu was going to happen, it would have happened a lot long before we had the chance to evolve the capacity to come up with a global warming theory. Yes, it did happen in the past, and you are simply unaware of the fact. If Molyneux had chosen to interview a paleoclimatologist, then maybe he would have been told about the periods in geological history where we had very strong warming because of rising Katu levels. There was the Cambrian hyperwarming event when carbon dioxide levels rose so much, reaching levels 20 times higher than today, that they triggered feedback processes that turned a frozen planet into a hothouse. Even though the sun was far weaker than today, these processes even melted the ice at the poles. To take another example, at the end of the Permian, carbon dioxide released by flood basalt warmed the Earth so much that methane hydrates on the ocean floor were released, sending temperatures even higher because methane is another powerful greenhouse gas that breaks down to form carbon dioxide. It's another example of positive feedback, and again the Earth became a hothouse and the ice caps melted. Closer to home, we've seen very strong warming at the end of each glaciation. The warming was triggered by a small increase in solar forcing, but it was the positive feedback that resulted from this that melted ice sheets the size of continents several miles deep. Whether you want to call this runaway warming, or warming that causes the ice at both poles to disappear, or even use the term that scientists use, which is hyperwarming, is entirely up to you. Whatever you want to call it, the fact remains that the average temperature of the Earth over the last 500 million years has ranged from about 10 to 22, warming and cooling between these extremes not once but several times. Now please don't pose comments like "Nia," and this happened long before cars and humans came along, because firstly scientists have concluded that the cause of these warming and cooling events was changes in Katu concentration. Yes, despite what the bloggers may have led you to believe, researchers have shown a very clear correlation between temperature and Katu over the last 500 million years. The reason for the discrepancy is that bloggers conveniently leave out growing solar power. And secondly, you might accept that there were extreme ranges of temperature in the past. Well done, but we're dealing in this video with Molyneux' belief, which is that global temperature has always been stable. And if you want to argue that the warming never reached the point where we became as hot as Venice, of course it didn't, for the same reason that when you leave your car in the hot sun with the windows up, it heats up, but never reaches the point where the inside melts. I've explained this physical principle before in me videos. There must be mechanisms by which any sort of big spike or change in the system is self-correcting. Why must there be? It's lovely to have dreams and hopes, but we're not living in the world of Hollywood or even magic. We're in the real world where these things actually did happen. If average global temperature rose 12 degrees centigrade in the past because of rises in carbon dioxide levels, what? The problem is Molyneux doesn't even accept that these huge climate swings happened at all. Instead, he just listens to people who have no knowledge on the subject, who simply echo his beliefs. I agree with you. There must be some kind of negative feedback that tends to keep the Earth's temperature about the same. No, it hasn't stayed about the same. About this is oh, never mind. Look, trying to hope that there's some sort of mechanism that must have created a condition that didn't exist is like making a wish within a dream. Stephan, why not learn about real climate science from people other than those who echo your belief that it's all a conspiracy? I'm sure it won to change your conviction that it is all a conspiracy. But at least you can now concentrate on trying to show that these conclusions are wrong instead of believing they don't exist. I hope you don't mind me being so blunt, but you did, after all, claim that this was your goal. I mean, there's nothing more boring than somebody who's only ever looked at evidence which supports his or her own conclusions. Look at the contrary evidence, and that will breed, I think, a very important and virtuous humility.